Hi, Scott Blakely here from Blakely Bassoon Studios and Lil Ass Kicker's Bassoon Reads. Today we'll be looking at the third movement of Mozart's Bassoon Concerto, or K191 if you're nasty. Specifically, we'll be looking at measures 21 through 44 of the third movement. Even more specifically, we'll be using the Weisberg edition, as this is what is specified for California All-State Band auditions. Now, it just so happens that I've sat on the audition panel for California All-State Bands for most of the past 10 years, so if you're doing this audition, you might want to listen to what I have to say. And if you're not doing this audition, you might want to listen to what I have to say. Mozart marks the tempo of this as tempo di what the fuck? So what does it mean? Well, that means the tempo of a minuet. Now, what is a minuet? A minuet is a moderately paced social dance that originally became popular in the Baroque era. I think it's pretty interesting that Mozart and a bunch of other composers would use this tempo marking, because to me it seems like it either indicates that the composers had very little ego and did not expect their music to be played hundreds of years after they were written, or that they were so convinced that the minuet was going to remain in style for hundreds of years to come. There are very few people whom you could ask, hey, what's the tempo of a minuet? That would really have any authority in answering that question. Even in Mozart's day, this is a dance that's popular throughout a good chunk of Europe. Most indications are the tempo is probably somewhat different depending on region. But in general, the idea is that this is a moderate social dance. In other words, the tempo shouldn't be faster than you can move your feet. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. By Mozart's time, the minuet was more than just a dance. It had sort of become a musical form as well. There are some indications that minuet, the musical form, was actually a little bit faster than minuet, the dance form. Obviously, if you don't have to worry about people moving their feet, you can go faster. On the other hand, Mozart would often use the tempo indication minuetto allegretto, indicating a somewhat faster minuet. And of course, there's the whole question of how much does one care about this? I don't actually think we need to play this at the same tempo as Mozart may have originally intended, or the tempo that people have played it for, the past 200 years. But it did get me thinking, got the noggin kind of flowing here. I do think a lot of people play this movement a little bit faster than it needs to be. And part of it is because I don't think that it's really all that impressive to play this fast. It's kind of hard to play it at a faster tempo than a slower tempo, but it's not like, whoa, look at how fast they can go. So I don't think there's really a point of showing off your speed in this movement. And we have the first movement marked allegro, which I think probably is meant to feel faster than this. The other thing I want to sort of mention is that when we're thinking about establishing our tempo for this, I wouldn't think of the bassoon entrance first, where we have all these triplets, because that's kind of an intense subdivision. It's important to think of the main beat and the main melody. Dee dee da dee da da, dee da dee da, dancing moderately dee, dee da dee da da. I mean, even this, like 1, 2. If you're actually taking steps, moving around, I think that's almost pushing the feel of moderate. What I was trying to say is that tempo is pushing the feel of moderate, but for some reason the video file got corrupted, and therefore we're stuck on this lovely face. Let's talk about the very first section. This was actually the first movement of the concerto that I ever worked on. And of course, when I first started looking at it, trying to play it, in high school, I was like, oh, this is hard. This is pretty hard. And yeah, there's a degree of difficulty here. But honestly, these notes fit pretty well in the hand. They're also, in a relatively comfortable range of the instrument. And like I said, I don't think it's really that fast. What I think much of the difficulty of this comes from is visually following the music, or what I often refer to as visually tracking the notes. A lot of us get really caught up in sort of keeping our eyes glued to each note as we play it, and it's really easy to get tripped up when you do that. If you think about when we learn how to read, a beginning reader will sort of look at every letter of a word, articulation, and sort of sound it out, right? And so a beginning reader has trouble reading quickly with any sort of natural flow to it. But as you get older, you can look at an entire word and just say, oh, that's articulation. So how do we practice to sort of expand our ability to do this? And my recommendation is, with this movement in particular, is I think it's important to practice this one measure plus the additional downbeat at a time, and as sort of the first step. In other words, we'd be practicing somewhat like this. And what you can really do is you can start to, get your memory working better here. You can get yourself away from staring at the page, look at it at the beginning, but then say, okay, I think I know the first measure now. Go ahead and even close your eyes and just play that measure. Right, and by the way, I don't know if you just heard what I just did, is that last slur from measure 21 to measure 22 had a little blip in it. I'm trying to do it on purpose now. And by the way, this is something I've caught myself doing, I catch my students doing very frequently. There's something kind of tricky about the mechanics of that slur. And that's the kind of thing that you likely won't notice if you're practicing in a longer section. But when I just play the singular measure, it kind of sticks out. It's easier for me to notice, and I can catch it, because little things like this will contribute to our overall feeling of instability as we play this. And if we start to feel unstable, well, we're gonna fall apart, right? So yeah, I would want to take a moment and work on that slur. One of the things that I would recommend is try to figure out which hand or which finger to sort of concentrate on more. I think of this as like the leader fingers. So if I play this slur right now, I'm going to really think about my left hand and see what happens. And by the way, I'm pushing my speed right now because I want to catch myself kind of messing up while I focus on this hand, which I've done a couple times, but it's going fairly well. Okay, so now what I'm going to try doing is I'm going to focus on my right hand instead. The slur is much cleaner when I'm focusing on my right hand. I wasn't expecting that, to be perfectly honest. So like I've kind of, not only have I worked on this slur, but I've learned something that, hey, think more about the right hand than the left for that slur, and it'll probably be cleaner. So another thing that you may have observed me just doing is actually kind of playing a little bit faster. I will use playing faster as a sort of tool similar to playing slower. It's a tool. It's going to help me do something. Playing faster can sometimes help me exploit a weakness and find out what's not working sooner. You might not need to do that in this particular instance. So I want to make sure that we're getting back to our more moderate dance tempo. After getting comfortable with this one measure at a time, I think it can actually be useful to go to 2 measures. And we're not going to then go to 3 and then 4, but just because of the way the sort of phrasing works of this music, I think 2 measure stints are useful. And it also helps us sort of expand that memory. So again, you can certainly look at the music whenever you truly need to, but then try to look away when you're doing a 2 measure section. So by practicing in these sort of small sections, we're really doing multiple things. One, we're sort of strengthening our ability to look at a whole beat or a whole measure even at a time, rather than visually tracking individual notes. Or really getting to the point where we're just outright memorizing it, which I think is, for a piece like this, something that is really worth considering doing. And regardless of whether you truly memorize it, the sheet music should really just mostly be a security blanket to you. Otherwise, you probably haven't been practicing enough, or you haven't been exercising your memory enough. In addition to sort of working on a memory, we're able to, again, notice little imperfections a little bit easier. Also, this allows us to bring our tempo up sooner, because if we're having to play the thing, really long sections, you're probably going to need to play it slower, otherwise you're going to have a ton of mistakes. Whereas if you're only playing a measure or 2 at a time, hopefully if you have any mistakes, you're going to have 1 or 2. In other words, you're going to make so few mistakes that you'll know what they are and then be able to go back and work on them to improve them, as opposed to just sort of playing through something and having a general sense of like, oh, that wasn't so good, or it's kind of messy or whatever. We really want to be specific about whatever problems we're running into. So one thing that I noticed is in measure 23 feels a little bit stickier than some of the other measures to me. And I think the reason why that is because the second note of the first 2 triplets, because they have these big sort of jumps to them, that those second notes feel a little bit more important than the downbeats. And I think that sort of creates a little bit of instability. I mean, I could try to bring that out. I don't think that's really necessary. But again, that's the kind of thing that I can actually notice and hear and take more control over. Measure 25. We have a repeat. Measures 25 and 26 are exactly the same thing as measures 21 and 22. And I'm a little surprised at Arthur Weisberg here, because if you've watched my other videos, you know that I've been rather opinionated about some of the additions that he makes. And he doesn't do anything special here. He doesn't do anything, at least in his addition, to indicate, hey, maybe you want to play this a little differently since it's a repeat of what you just played. It doesn't, to me, feel like what he's been doing, what he generally does with it. He's added a lot of dynamics and articulations in a lot of other places, but here he doesn't make any changes other than the slurs that he already put in. But I believe that there should be some contrast as we get to a new section. And if I'm going to try to stick to the articulation and the dynamic in this edition, that kind of takes away a lot of the ways in which I could change it, right? I'm sure you've heard people, sometimes they might play these next two measures a lot more softly, or they might add slurs. But I want to take a little bit of liberty here. What I've decided to do personally is I'm going to make the notes a little bit shorter there. If I'm sort of going in the spirit of wanting to stick to the edition, I feel like playing notes a little shorter than indicated, since they're not indicated as particularly short or particularly long, you can kind of get away with another corrupt file, another flattering freeze frame. All I was trying to say is that I feel like you can get away with changing the lengths of the notes a little more easily than you can outright changing the very nature of articulation from slurred to tongued. And in the context of, say, an audition where you were given a specific addition, this might be a way to spice things up a bit without offending some stuffy old audition judge. Something I haven't really taken the opportunity to talk about in the other videos I've done on the Mozart, how, hey, this is not necessarily a slur or a dynamic that Mozart wrote. And I found it really helpful to find the earliest known edition of this, which is, for all intents and purposes, probably closer to what is in Mozart's original manuscripts. There are those performers who are very interested in being as true to the composer's intention as possible. I am not one of those people, particularly for composers who have been dead for a couple hundred years. But I am interested in it because I like to observe how much freedom other musicians take to put their own mark on this. And when we start to realize, like, oh, hey, this slur that I thought was, just part of the music is actually just someone's opinion of how it should be played. This dynamic is just one person's opinion. And in taking note of that, it allows you to question and develop your own opinions, and empowers you, I think, to recognize that you can do something with your own opinion. And, if you think something should be played louder, or if you think something should be slurred instead of tongued, that you can make that decision, that you have that right as a musician to make the music sound as good as you think it can sound. Of course, when we are talking about auditions, it gets a little complicated because generally we're trying to impress the panel, and we sometimes may not know exactly what they're looking for, and if they've asked for something specific, it can be to our detriment if we deviate from the specifics that they've asked for. I do think that people generally appreciate musicality, and even if your musicality doesn't have a seal of approval from your local musicological expert, your musicality is up to you to develop. So don't let anyone stop you from developing it by saying, oh, that's not a good idea. Well, explore your ideas. And if they say it's not a good idea, ask them why. Decide if you agree with their reason why. In measure 27, the section I just played and sort of felt a little bad about, is this trill, the C to D trill. It looks like a simple trill, it's just one finger, but it's nasty. It's a really tricky trill, especially if you're right-handed, like normal people. It's the weaker hand and it's the weaker finger. And, while this trill is not usually a problem if it's a really quick trill, these are somewhat extended. And like I've mentioned in the videos I've done on the other movements, trills, I think, are important to practice out of context and not so much for speed. Trills don't, by the way, have to be fast all the time, although it can be nice to do a very fast trill sometimes, but for comfort and efficiency. So what I would do with this trill is I'd spend some time just sort of playing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by kind of finding the minimum amount I can move this finger and keep it comfortable. I don't actually have to move it very much. Now, it's a little bit hard to control when I'm that close, hence why it's worth practicing. And honestly, worth practicing kind of slow. I'm really looking for tension in my arm, in my hand, because if I'm tense, it's not going to be something I can sustain very well. Sometimes I might set out to say, okay, I'm going to try doing some really quick burst. Or, you know, I can already feeling that, by the way. But in the beginning, I really just want to just get a feel for this. Really start to associate, teach myself that this is just a way to be. Yeah, it's just a way to be on that note. You know, you can just kind of wiggle. I want to develop some relationship between what I hear and what I feel. So I'm just going to play around with it. Now, another thing that I could do if I wanted to sort of change the speed, I could start by just move my fingers further away and then start bringing the finger closer and closer, sort of like a bouncing ball, kind of dropping, right? Whatever. Okay. Basically, it's just another way of thinking of doing a trill that accelerates in speed. Rather than actually moving my finger faster, I could think about it as just moving my finger less and closer to the instrument. Depending on the situation, you might not find it the best way to go about accelerating a trill. You also may not be wanting to accelerate your trill, but it's just another little trick from dear old Scotty. Now, especially when you're playing this movement without an accompaniment, I think it's really crucial to have a way to keep your tempo when transitioning from measures 27, 28, and 29. Because we have a somewhat sustained trill, we have quarter note rest, and we're making a transition from triplets to 16th notes essentially. So it's very easy to kind of just lose our sense of rhythm there when we don't have anything to do. If you're playing with an accompaniment and just sort of listening, that's one way to sort of deal with this. But if you're playing a cappella, which is the situation for most auditions, you've really just got to keep the tempo going. And it's really easy to ignore this and just be thinking about getting all the notes. But if you can play this in a way that preserves your sense of tempo, then I think you'll impress the people listening a lot more. So here's what I do, by the way. First of all, with the trills, I just think it takes practice to count and trill at the same time. It takes really feeling comfortable with a trill so that you're not thinking about the trill as you do it and you can just be counting. Now, when I get to measure 28, what I do is I will count that quarter note as 1. I'll count the first quarter rest as 2. But then for the third beat, in my mind, I like to count 16th notes. 1, 2, 3, E, and up. And that really helps me make that transition with more confidence and I just think with more accuracy too between measures 27 and 28. That's a real hidden spot that a lot of people have trouble with, and they never even realize they're having trouble with it because they're not thinking so much about the rest, and it's really easy to just sort of fall apart there. In that next measure, measure 29, I find the E natural my fingers don't like it. My fingers don't like E natural. And I've noticed that it trips up a lot of other players too. I don't think it's just me. For some reason, we don't like that E natural there. It's not that even necessarily that we don't play an E natural, but it's that the fingers get a little bit gummed up there and things just start to sound a little messy. And when we sound messy, we start to feel bad, and then we start to play the next thing bad, and we just fall apart. So I want to avoid feeling bad. That's why I play bassoon. What I find really useful for me is I will practice that measure by putting a big pause right before the E natural. Oh yeah, and Weisberg wants this to be mezzo piano. I'm not sure why, but that's what it says. So let's try to play it a little bit more mezzo. So after I've done that for a bit, then I'll take that pause out. And it will feel much more comfortable. Although, you know, it's the kind of thing that I might go back and put that pause back in there every once in a while if I ever find myself my fingers kind of just getting out of sync there. So let's talk about measures 33 through measure 37. If you watched my previous video on the second movement, you'll remember that my favorite measure in the entire concerto is measure 14. And I know, it's just a whole note, but it's not just a whole note. Here we have 4 dotted half notes tied together. And as much as I would like for this to also be one of my favorite measures, it's not. I just haven't been able to make it my favorite. The role that this sort of sustain has, like, why is it there? What are we accomplishing, right? Whereas in the second movement, I think we're really just sort of floating above in canon with these strings. Here, we're really just sort of like sustaining within them. I think in a sense, maybe we're sort of building like some suspense, like where's it gonna go? I'm not trying to say I hate this section, but there's a little bit less to do here. And I think it's also a challenge because when we're playing really long notes, our brain has a real tendency to just kind of go, yeah, and speed ahead. When you're playing with accompaniment, you can teach yourself to learn the accompaniment and just listen. And you can spend your time listening to the lovely strings or the piano or whatever your accompaniment is, rather than counting. But if you're playing a cappella, you've got to count. And what I find here useful is I sort of count the accompaniment. So what's being played in the strings is like it's 1E and a 2 and 3 at a 1E and a 2 and 3. There's like a couple 30-second notes. I think those 30-second notes are kind of easy to sort of mess up in your mind, especially if you're sustaining over it. So I simplify the rhythm, and I, to myself, will count 1E and a 2 and 3, 1E and a 2 and 3. If you're playing this edition, then you start trilling 1E and a 2 and 3, 1E and a 2 and 3. And I find that's really helpful for getting through this sort of long, sustained note. It helps me have some sense of direction as I play it, and also to sort of just embrace whatever the function is here, which I think is sort of sustain. So with that trill, I actually kind of want to sort of be sneaky about it. The trills, maybe you can think of it as a indication of getting antsy to go on and play to the next section. That's where we really get to fly or something, right? Just as a good reminder is that when you're playing something and you just sort of feel like, I don't know how to make this interesting, or this you start to feel kind of bored or feel like, what's the point here? That should challenge you as a musician to come up with something, come up with a reason. Why is it there? How can we make it have a purpose? And it doesn't have to be the most profound thing. If I have a sense of meaning and purpose for those notes, it helps me do something with it, I'm not just sitting there, right? That's what it can feel like to play there. I don't know if I would put a trill at measures 34 and 35, but Arthur Dubs did. So I think that if you've been asked to play this edition, you should probably play that trill, unless you might upset someone you wouldn't upset me on the panel, but I've sat with other people who sometimes are like, why didn't they play the trill there? With the trill, I think it's a little hard to get out of. And so what I like to do is I will take a slight liberty and I end the trill right at the end of measure 36. In other words, I don't think of that 8th note as having a trill. And it sort of helps me sort of solidify that note. If you think 1, 2, 3, yum, ba da ba da dum. Something about the 16th notes from like measure 37, 38, 40, 41, 42, they tend to get played unintentionally staccato. There's something about playing fast-tongued notes where our tongues just naturally want to turn them staccato. And a lot of times stylistically it can work. It doesn't necessarily sound bad for this to be staccato. The problem is that when we play staccato, we're essentially creating a lot of silence between the notes. And when we create that silence, then we can't hear what's happening. In other words, if our fingers are out of sync, or even if like we're playing, if our intonation is really bad, it's harder to hear because there's so much silence in between notes. So I really encourage people when they're practicing, especially in the beginning, regardless of what their aesthetic is for the 16th notes, is to play them long. And especially when you play those notes more slowly, I think having a more tenuto articulation is helpful. It helps us keep control over the instrument. Later on on, if you start to feel like, you want to put some more intentionally staccato stuff in there, you can. You risk sounding sort of more mechanical, machine gun-like. To me, staccato is a little bit special, and I'm not hesitant to use it, but I don't want to use it without really deciding like, oh yeah, let's make that note a little special, or let's make this section a little crispy or something, right? Another thing that can happen in these measures is it can be very tempting not to flick here. And I really cannot emphasize enough the importance of flicking. Not only does flicking allow the notes to speak more reliably and cleanly, but I think in this instance, it once again sort of helps us keep control. It sort of makes us more aware of the notes we're playing when we play them. So I'm gonna let you watch my thumb here for this one. And in fact, I'm not even flicking, I'm really more so what you would call venting. Venting is when we hold the key down for the entire note. Flicking would be just sort of pressing it real quick for the beginning of the note. These notes are so short that we're basically holding them down for the whole note. Anyways, watch my thumb here. When I do this, I'm more aware of the notes I'm playing when I play them. And another way to think of it is sort of like if I'm going to speak words very precisely, it might feel like overkill sometimes, but when I do make sure each and every consonant is clear, I'm become incredibly aware of what I am saying. Flicking can sometimes have that sort of effect. I mean, it's not as overkill as speaking in this way, but it has a similar effect in that it makes what we're doing more intentional, and intent is such a huge part of music making. I think the final thing I wanted to touch on with this movement is how I feel that measures 43 and measures 39, the F naturals tend to stick out. The F just wants to be louder. I think it has to do with there being less resistance on that note. I think it has to do with the timbre. I was checking this with a tuner. I actually was checking it with a decibel meter, and I was finding that I wasn't actually playing the note so much louder. One of the reasons why it's so hard to put a microphone on a bassoon is that depending on what note we're playing, the sound comes out different spots. And so, I think that when we play an open F, we have a lot of sound that's sort of coming out here, maybe even a little bit out backwards. But if I'm playing a C, obviously no sound isn't coming out here. It's coming out down here and up here. That may be part of why it sounds louder. It also, I think it's really easy to play those notes out too much. I think it can be really useful and helpful, rather than telling yourself, oh, pull back, don't play that F so loud, is to give some more heft and weight to the notes before it, particularly the 16th note D. And then when you get to the F, you don't pull back, you just don't push anymore. That's sort of mentally what's going on in my head, is sort of this like, I'm not, as opposed to, I'm not pulling back, I'm just not pushing anymore. We'll see how the microphone likes that volume coming directly from me. And look at that, we've already gotten to the end of the section here. I realize that there's plenty more of this movement, but look at how long this video already is. And if you would like more or have specific questions about anything you're working on, I am available for virtual lessons on a regular or occasional basis. Once again, thank you for watching, and happy practicing. Dee-da, dancing moderately, dee. Be-da-dee-da-da. I mean, I'm become incredibly aware of what I am saying, especially if you're right-handed, like normal people. Da-dee-da-dee-da.